my writing, I've always enjoyed writing short stories and poetry, and I'd never really done anything biographical or historical until I started working on my PhD here at Lincoln. And I was taking a class from Dr. Fran Kay, a Plains literature class, and one of the books that we were assigned to read was Letters of a Woman Homesteader. And I just fell in love with the book immediately, and so chose that as the book to write my paper for the course on. What's interesting about Stewart is that she has a lot of audiences. She has an audience of people who like pioneer literature, Plains literature. She has an audience of women who enjoy someone as a model, a strong woman to model after them. Children love reading her stories because they're exciting adventures. She is above all a great storyteller. And historians read her works because she is fairly accurate, although she, as I say, embroiders her works. I think she does paint us a true period of what it was, a true picture of what it was like to grow up during this time period. And sociologists like to study her because you see patterns of women's communities, the importance of letters in women's lives on the plains, the importance of having someone to talk to bond with. Elinore goes out and sells war bonds, gets involved in the Depression movement, gets involved with the war effort. And so her audiences, and I think that's why she is so popular even today, is that her audience is so broad, so many areas. And in the course of doing my research, I found nothing had been written on her. And so I found the names and addresses of the children who were still living and wrote to them, or I called them and talked to them, and I finally got a hold of the son, Clyde. And he was sort of reluctant at first about giving any information, so I went ahead and wrote the paper, and when it was done, I sent him a copy and called him to see what he thought about it, and he was just thrilled, and he said, I have a whole bunch of unpublished letters and stories of my mother. Do you want to do something with them? And I said yes, and so that's what started me on this book. As Stewart's writing progressed, she drew slightly away from a continuing story embedded within several letters to a more formal short story, only perfunctorily prefaced by her salutation, "Dear friend." After the publication of the Culbertson stories in the Youth Companion, the short story itself became her genre. No longer did a plot string itself throughout several letters. Seldom did her chatty intimacies of daily life frame her fictions. Instead, her stories, especially those sent to Mrs. Allen, seemed to be appendixes to her personal letters, and the letters themselves, although still intriguing, appear to be more newsy than crafted. Also, Stewart's 1930 story of a wild horse hunt is separate from the letter announcing her intention of writing it, and from the following letter apologizing for her seemingly uncivilized behavior. So what I noticed in this reading was that her stories sort of grouped themselves into three categories. And so I thought for fun I would sort of shuffle them into these categories and read you some stories from each of the categories, which I have arbitrarily called, number one, her everyday letters, number two, her embroidered letters, and number three, her local color fiction. I have a list afterwards. I hope to leave some time for questions if any of you are interested, if you've read the book, to see which letters I would put into which category. So I will give those to you later. Here is an example of one of her everyday letters. It was written to Miss Mariah Wood, her correspondent from Lexington, Missouri. Miss Mariah wrote to Elinore after she had read her works in the Atlantic Monthly, and she thought they were so good that she wanted to tell Elinore how good they were. Atlantic Monthly then forwarded the letters on to Elinore, and she decided that she liked Miss Wood and was going to continue corresponding with her, which she did for the rest of her life. She said, "You sound like someone I would like for a friend. Shall we be friends from now on?" Wouldn't that be great to write to someone like Louise Erdrich or someone, and then all of a sudden you could correspond the rest of your life? This is a letter. I'll be reading excerpts because some of her letters are rather long. My dear friend, 1914. Do you smell my bread baking? Shall I send you a piece of my coffee cake? We like it with cinnamon, raisins, and sugars in it, and it is raising fine. It will soon be ready for the oven. I've had a neighbor from higher up in the mountains here with me for a week helping me sew. She has the dearest little girl, Edith, that Jareen writes of. They have only lately moved on to their ranch, which they call the Bluebird Ranch. And they were from Idaho. Their little Edith has had kindergarten training, so she knows many pretty little games and songs. I am mighty glad to have her visit Jareen. The snow is falling so fast that I can't see the barn, yet I have another visitor, an old lady 60 years old who has homesteaded on a mountainside across the creek north of us. It's 7 or 8 miles over there, but I can see their lamplight from my back porch. She has come all the way to teach me to make ginger drop cakes. I just love people. She is the dearest dumpy little thing. Perhaps that's why I love her, for I am not little nor dumpy either. I should like to be small and graceful, but I am 5 feet 6 inches tall and weigh almost 200 pounds. I have heavy black hair and brown eyes. She and Edith make themselves a doll quilt. Jareen loves dolls, but some misfortune has happened to every one she's had. Santa Claus brought her a beauty, but one day Calvin got it and broke its head all to bits before we knew it. She has another, but we can't keep its hair on. The parcel post has been the most wonderful benefit we have ever had for people situated as we are. We have just received 3 cases of canned goods by mail. After our present supply is gone, we shall get flour and sugar by mail. Jareen says, tell dear Mary Celeste that she has not forgotten her. Will you forgive me this long letter? With much love, Elinore Stewart. Her view as she continued writing to her correspondence expanded from just the everyday life within the homestead and around the ranch to a wider world view. And it can be seen in this letter that she wrote in 1932 to another one of her correspondents, Mr. Zeiss. He was a blind man from Cape Cod, and I particularly like the story she read to him because she is trying to paint a picture, and her letters become very visual and have a great deal of appeal to the senses. Our local Red Cross is 60 miles away. We ranch women found it hard to work with the chapter because of the distance and our own work. We were not satisfied either with the way some of the relief work was being done. For instance, the outing flannel issued by the government was made into pajamas, and those were given out to the youths and the men beating their way from coast to coast. Sleeping garments meant nothing to men who had to sleep in freight cars or any place they could. We ranch women felt that the cloth should have been kept for needy families, both in town and in the rural districts. Town members felt that the rural women should have nothing to say, since they were not there to sew on the days set for work, and they never got their garments there in time to be checked and distributed. It was hard for us to get the garments into town, even when we found time to sew. The women in Burnt Fork lived a 3 days wagon trip to town and 3 days back. It was 60 miles. And Elinore, even in 32, did not have a car. So it was a whole week's trip just to take cloth in. So it's understandable why they were sort of put out with the town women. So we decided to do our relief work in our own way. Early in the spring, we checked up the families in our own community who would probably need help this winter. There was so little money to be had that seeds for the garden planting were hard to get. We tithed our own supply and gave to the families that needed help. Then we took turns at calling on the ones being helped to make sure that the gardens were being properly planted and cared for, so on through the canning and drying seasons. Those who have cars went to the needy homes and took the mothers to all of the demonstrations put on by the Extension Service of our university to teach rural women the preparation and care of food, cheese making, canning, and preserving. Next, we tithed ourselves to accumulate a surplus to help out our town sisters. But we didn't take our town sisters' words for anything. We sent our own investigator, who was instructed to visit around casual-like and find out the truth of the situation and get the names of the families needing neighborly help, not charity. It has been fun and has given much satisfaction, even though the work has been hard. I think we helped ourselves as much as anyone else. We know what we can do when we are under stress. The next series of letters are probably my favorite ones, and they're the ones that I call the embroidered letters. What I think these letters are letters of incidents that really happened to her, or of people that she really met. Only, like Clyde, her son Clyde told me, Elinore never let facts get in the way of a good story. And so she embroidered them and made them sound maybe just a little bit better than they really were. She even questioned herself about how much fiction she used in her writing. One of her correspondents complained about her writing was too much fiction. And this is what she has to say. This is a letter to Mrs. Coney's daughter. You say that I have an unusual knack of meeting extraordinary people. Miss Harrison once wrote me that she didn't like a letter because she didn't like the fiction. So I had a session with myself to determine whether I do fictionalize, or how it happens that others seem not to see what I do in those we meet in passing. I have come to the conclusion that it is because most of my friends are cultured people and I am not. I have absolutely no manners, and therefore I can and do ask questions, can mingle with anybody and everybody, since I have no standard to support. And so that's how she justifies her embroidered letters. I think as I did my research in the periodicals, these turn-of-the-century children's periodicals, I noticed that the women were very strong in them. You didn't see very many of the stories of the quote-unquote reluctant pioneer woman. Many of them took an active part in their life. The small difference that I noticed, though, was that many of the women, just to be courageous was a big deal for them. The men was always considered that they were already courageous. But for the women to do something like go out and homestead and pioneer, it was an important thing. But as I read through the years, I got a very strong sense of the enjoyment that women found in the plains, the great courage that they had, and the energy and the ability to work right alongside of the men. And that, too, is what Elinore personified to me, the strong woman who said any woman can do anything she wants to if she's not afraid of hard work. The embroidery story that I would like to read to you is from a May 15th, 1928 letter to my dear friend, Mrs. Florence Allen. She wrote 2 stories about moonshiners. She was evidently intrigued by the subject. And this is the second of the 2, and I feel the better of the 2. It's interesting because in this story, Elinore, or the woman homesteader persona, leaves the woman's sphere of the homestead and even the ranching duties, and now she's out traipsing over the countryside, breaking open whiskey barrels and acting like a revenuer. Her style also has changed a little bit by this writing. And again, I'll be just reading you a few excerpts from the stories. Mrs. Pond, one of her neighbors and one of the friends who is quite often the same character with different names. She's called Ma Gillis, Mrs. Pond, or Ma Dallas quite often. She's Mrs. Pond in this story, has come by to get her to go out hunting raspberries. But the real truth is Mrs. Pond needs help looking for these moonshiners. And it's interesting, too, in this story that she becomes a more fully developed character than some of the other characters in her other works. So they're riding along, and they come upon a sheep herder with a flock of sheep, and Mrs. Pond believes it is not a real sheep herder, but is a lookout, and they're getting close to a distillery. "Bye-bye, Mr. Sheep Herder, what ain't," she said to herself. This is Mrs. Pond. He couldn't have heard her. We rode slowly along the road, once more among the Badland hills. "You see that white streak of road that goes over the rise away ahead of us? Well, that is the last place he can see us without following us. He will be on some of these hills watching to see if we cross that. When he sees us go over that white rise, he will think we are heading for home. But I've been around these hills myself, and I know my way about. But I want to be sure I'm right before we make any change. You take my bridle and lead my horse right on. I want to sit backward in the saddle so I can watch the hilltops." Without dismounting, she turned face to tail, and we rode slowly along the hot road. Pretty soon she chuckled. "Right. He is watching, but all of his doubts and suspicions will be settled when we pass this white place. Slowly she rode on, she still sitting backward. The very minute we passed over the high spot, she jerked our horses around toward the west, out of the road, up a dry wash. We kept in the washes, but kept as close to the hills as we could. It was past noon when we got back to the fossil diggings. Cautiously, slowly, silently, at last we gained a vantage point and looked down on a strange scene. We were high up under the ledge, but there was sufficient brush to conceal us. Down below us, the dry course of Sage Creek twisted itself into the letter S. In the curve of the X next to us, we counted 12 log houses and a huge, low, barn-like structure. We could see what looked like silos, not so tall as others I had seen, but I can't think of anything else to compare them to. As we looked, a truck backed out of the barn. It was loaded with casks. Presently another came and was driven into the barn. We could hear the thumps of the loads being placed. Some filled wool sacks were thrown on top, and a tarpaulin was tied over each truck. Then both trucks drove away, right up the creek bed. No road, not a sign of a trail or anything to show that there was a place. We had the only place from which the place could be seen without walking right into it. I don't know how we made our way back. I was so excited I couldn't talk. There was no mistaking what the place was. The smell betrayed it. It was not the smell of a sheep ranch. We mounted, and just as carefully as before we made our way back to our cache. Still keeping to the draws instead of across the mesa, we rode for the forest. And so Elinore and Mrs. Pond alert the revenuers, and this is what happens. It seems that the government man had no idea of finding such a big thing. They were not prepared to fight such odds that they almost made a fizzle of their raid, but a plant like that is too big to get away entirely. They caught the 4 ringleaders. They apprehended thousands of gallons of booze and destroyed thousands of dollars worth of equipment. Now this story is one of those stories I wasn't quite sure whether she actually did this or if she heard this happening and pretended she did and made it all up. So this is sort of an in-between embroidery letter or not. Another interesting story, one of the ones that would also be in between the embroidered story and the local color fiction would be the story of Goof, the young man she meets on a trip back to Boulder, or back from Boulder to Wyoming. For a few years, the family was unable to keep up their home in Boulder, where the children were staying to go to school, plus the ranch, so they moved all their belongings back to Colorado. And then in 1924, they moved back to Burnt Fork. Clyde went on ahead, and so Elinore and her 3 boys took a 2-horse team and an open wagon and went on a 500-mile, 25-day trip in the spring across the mountains, the Rocky Mountains, through Rabbit Ears and Berthoud Passes. And so this is a story about a young man they may have met on the route. This was in 1926. We had just stopped to camp on Fall River, just out of Idaho Springs. All day long we had been dodging autos, turning out for them, nosing into hillsides or perching on perilous edges. We had not seen a team, not a horse. We felt like intruders in a world of autos. My nerves were in a tangle. I was glad to stop and get down off the high seat of the wagon. It should have been a beautiful camping place. Nature had done much for it. Beautiful, roaring, cascading Fall River on one side and wild hills all around. But the river was blue from the tailings from the mine. All along its banks were heaps of rubbish, disgusting to the extreme. They used the river edge for a city dump. There was nowhere else to camp, so I looked out the cleanest place I could find and began to unpack. About this time, another wagon rumbled into view. It was a ramshackle affair, piled high with odds and ends of household furnishings. Atop the load was a man who knew very little about handling a team. He was a young man, probably about 25 years old. He was awkward and fat, but he drove a team instead of a car, and my boys hailed him as a welcome addition to our small defense. The camping space was so small that it seemed a pity to have two fires, and I had mine going. My boys attended to their team and helped the newcomer with his. By that time, I had our supper of bacon and eggs ready, so we asked him to have a bite with us. He told us his name, but I don't remember it, and as he also told us that his friends called him Goof, that name remains in my recollection. So they travel on together for a day or two, and then they camp again another night. After supper, we put on our coats and sweaters, made a roaring fire, and sat around in deep content. We grew confidential. Goof told me that he grew up at an orphan's home and had been whipped 2,011 times for playing in the dirt. When he found out they would make him work in the garden to punish him, he became the worst boy in the home. He began to save his pennies to buy a farm with, and when he was 16 and had to get out of the home, he had saved 79 cents. Different persons had got him jobs on ranches and truck patches around Denver, but he was such a goof he couldn't stay with a job. One man fired him for sleeping with the pigs, and another was peeved because he said commence to the horses instead of get up. And so on and so on. He has reached a man's estate and gained a few smatterings of knowledge that he may in time find how to correlate. He knows which end of a horse to put a collar on, but he starts out on a week's journey with a wagon wired together. So they travel on together and they finally get to Berthoud Pass, but when they get there, the snows have just melted and a big, huge car has gotten mired in the mud. And the family is trying to push the car out, and one of the members of the family is a young girl. And the father becomes very rude and very angry with the girl and hits her. And Goof stands up for the girl and comes to her rescue. And then here's where it continues. Well, the government man took some chains and our horses and snaked the whole bunch out. Nina refused to go on with her people. She said she would go back to Portal and wait table in the boarding house. I think a girl's place is with her mother, so I refused to let her ride with me. I thought if she would go on if she got no sympathy from me. Not so. She said she would walk the few miles down to the place. I wanted nothing to do with the affair, so I pulled into the road the minute I could and went rattling and rumbling down. I wanted to get away before the parents did. And so they, as they look back, as they're going on through the pass, they look back and see Goof around with talking to the girl. This looks like a love story. The natural thing to say would be that they married and they lived as happily as long as the groceries lasted. I confess this is what I thought as I saw Goof moving about. At the same time, I wondered, what about his meals and his horse feed? Again, they go on. Goof passes them on the road but won't talk to them because Elinore wouldn't help the girl out. And then, lo and behold, the expected happens, as she says. The wagon tongue pulls out of Goof's wagon and he is stranded in the middle of the road. We stopped to help if we could, and his distress increased. At last he said, "Say, I got sore with you when you turned that girl down. I don't think I ought to let you help out, telling you that I think you acted kind of raw." I told him I didn't care what he thought. I just wanted to help so that the wagon could move on and let others use the road. As we worked, he got over his grouch and we talked quite comfortably. He told me that Nina had gone on with her people, but had reproved him for trying to get on without food or feed, and had made him promise to take care of himself. Hence the ham and the hay, bought at Tabernash. He confided that he had two reasons for his homesteading venture. One, he wanted a home, and that kind of work. The other, he expected to take kids from the home as fast as he was able and as many as he could to start them to happiness and independence. I didn't tell him that I thought he had found his woman there on top of the world. I still think he did, but it may be that I will never know. Just as the sun was burnishing the bosom of the Great Bear River with sunset glory, we left Goof. We couldn't have accepted his invitation to stay all night with him, for he completely filled his small domicile. And his personality more than changed it. He had changed. There, on the snow-wrapped mountaintop, he found someone who respected him, and he suddenly grew up. The last group of stories I would call the local color fiction, and I keep taking the moonshine stories in and putting them out of that subdivision, so I'm not exactly sure where they fit. I do think, however, this last story that I'm going to read would fit in very clearly with fiction. Number one, because I had asked Jareen about this story. It was Elinor's daughter. It was written in 1930, and she told me that her mother in her last years was totally, because of her health, was unable to go out riding and would be unable to do what she says she did in this story. She gets caught up in a wild horse stampedes and gallops across the desert on her horse and climbs up and down mountains, and that she would have been physically incapable. So I'm sort of cheating on putting this one in here, although we don't know if she might have done it earlier and just finally got around to writing it. I love this story because again, her writing is becoming more mature. Here's in this story, she's weaving together two plots, which is something she has never tried before. I neglected to mention to you at the beginning that she never had any formal education. All of her writing ability, all of her reading was done on her own, and so she was a self-educated woman. Anyway, she was supposed to go out and meet some friends on a wild horse hunt, and she got too busy and didn't get away from the ranch in time. And so she started late and missed them. And so she heads off across the desert, gets caught in a stampede, and ends up meeting another veteran who is living in a houseboat on the river. And so she talks to him for a while, and then she starts teasing him, accusing him of being a moonshiner. And this is what he says. "I suspect anyone would think that, my floating house and all, but I'm not. I don't mind relieving your very evident curiosity a little. I was overseas and came back with a lot the matter with me. My brother, 2 years younger than I, enlisted at the same time I did. He might have escaped the draft, but I urged him not to wait for it. I was burning up with the holy fire of patriotism. Damn foolishness, but I didn't know it then. I pointed out to him the fineness, beauty, nobility of offering ourselves a living sacrifice for humanity. Hell, he was sent to one training camp, I to another. It was just accident that I ever saw him again. We had both been shifted around a lot, neither of us much to write. Both in France, but neither knew that the other had left America. We had both found war to be not the glorious thing we had thought, but a foolish, useless, filthy slaughter. Morals, decency thrown to the winds. All of our thoughts of high sacrifice a delusion. We are just like cattle in a slaughter pen, no better, maybe worse, said Cliff. The world will be no better for this carnage. It doesn't matter. We had just as well die here as anywhere. Nothing matters." And they go on and talk a little bit more, and he says, the brother says that the two brothers decide that whoever dies, the other one will somehow send back a message from the beyond to tell them something about life or death or whatever happens after death. And he said, "I keep thinking of Cliff." Excuse me. "I keep thinking of Cliff. He's on my mind some way. We were orphans, brought up in a little backwater town and had never seen an electric light until we were quite big boys. Then one day we were taken to a town where there was electric lights. We were very anxious to see what they were like, so we hung around a post on the street, waiting to see how the light got there. Strangely enough, I was not looking at the lamp when the light flashed on, but at Cliff. That is the picture my memory carries of him. His head tilted a little to one side, a look that at the same time was all of eager happiness, expectancy, satisfaction on his face as the light suddenly flashed on. And that last night, when they were in the trenches, why he stood up, I don't know. There was a flare, and for just a second I saw him looking at the light exactly as he did when he was a boy and saw his first electric light. I was silent. I didn't know what to say. The grease in the pan was cold, the coffee cold. His face was drawn, and there was a look in his eyes that frightened me. He lighted a cigarette, his hands trembling so he could hardly hold the match. He looked so hopeless. I was so sorry for him. I wanted to comfort him. I found myself saying, it does matter. Every little single thing does. Millions of people have experienced the state of mind that you are in now. You cannot claim that Christ didn't matter, that Lincoln didn't. You can't say that it didn't matter that you felt for a little while the grand desire to help, to give yourself, your all for humanity. That it seems to be a failure is not your affair. What is your affair is that you did your part. A pounding rumble broke upon my consciousness. At first I thought it might be the high water which would be expected any time, and I sprang up to get ashore. But just then a few rocks rattled down the tall cliff opposite, and I stood as if paralyzed while 5 dark forms hurtled over the edge and struck the ice and water 300 feet below. Horses. My host paid no attention to them at all. When I could take my eyes from the dreadful sight, he was looking at me queerly. "Do you know," he said, "that I have been trying to account for the way Cliff has been in my mind all morning. It's your face. His face was powder-burned and mud-soiled just as yours is wind-burned and dirty. You look just as he looked the last time when you stood looking at the animal come over. And, why, the answer is just, it's all right here. It is civilization that is wrong." I couldn't wait to hear more. I ran over to the ice to where a huge black horse was floundering. The others had hit open water and had been washed under ice. The big black fellow had been captured and had gotten away. The wire that had been used to hobble him still hung to the poor broken leg. A heavy piece of iron that had been tied to his forelock so that when he ran, it beat him cruelly between the eyes. It was still there, the flesh beaten off of his face by the iron. That is one of the practices of horse hunters. Hobble their catches and tie on the pounder. Then they can be turned out to shift for themselves until the hunt is over. Then they are rounded up and taken to the ranch. The man shot the horse. Merciful. He removed the iron and the wire. "You have been magnificently free all of your life, old boy. Death has completed that freedom, but you shall not carry the shackles of the slavery you fought with you. Go on." A cake of ice broke away. The big body slid into the water and was gone. I think I thought that I've been born in the wrong time period. I wish I would have been born about the same time Elinore was in the 1870s or the 1880s. I grew up on a farm south of Minden, and my sister and I would ride our horses from the time we were about 4 years old till we were 12, all over the countryside bareback. And there was this big hill on the back of our farm that there were all these Indian relics where the Indians used to camp. And so I've always been interested in this time period in the settling of the West. And when I went to do my doctorate, I had wanted to work in American literature, but I hadn't really settled on what area. So when I took this class, I knew this is where I wanted to be. And that may be another reason, how I relate to her is because all of us go through transition periods in our lives where we have to make choices. We have to make decisions, and I was during a time in my life where I had to make a decision, I had to make a choice. And after reading her book, I said, yes, I can do it. I'm not afraid to work hard. I'm not afraid to take chances. And she also looked on life as an adventure. And if she got lost, it wasn't a tragedy, it was an adventure. And she took something negative and turned it around and made it work in a positive vein for her, which is why I titled my book, The Adventures of the Woman Homesteader, because life to her was an adventure no matter how other people may have looked at it. I have the original newspapers published in 1914 of her children's stories, Culbertson's children's stories. I have an original manuscript back there of one of her children's stories. I have original book reviews, all of these that Jareen gave me, back there for you to look at, and I wanted to schedule time for questions. And so if you have any questions about her life or her writing or my research, I'd be really glad to answer them now.
I think one of the most interesting stories in all this is how you came to do this research, and starting with the Plains Literature class. There are people here from a Plains Lit class who are doing projects on writing.
Yes. The genesis of this is really interesting, of my research. I started out, actually, I'd always loved pioneer literature and always loved Plains literature and wished I had been born back in the 1880s. But the reason I took the Plains Literature course was because I was commuting from Kearney and I needed 2 classes on one day, and that happened to be at that night. And so Fran Kay was teaching it, which also made me decide those were the days I would take those 2 classes. And so I started reading the assignments, and we had to write a paper, 1 paper for the end of the semester. Well, I wrote this paper for 2 reasons. Number 1, I wrote it because there was something about the story that appealed to me. There was something that made it interesting to read. She was so open. She was so honest. She was someone that appealed to me as a model, someone that I felt a strong woman who went on and did what she needed to do. Another thing was that I just gotten through, this is very honest, I just gotten through doing a bunch of research on George Eliot. Do you know how much criticism there is on George Eliot? And in order to do a good paper, you have to know what everybody else has written, right? And it's really hard to find something someone has not said, so I thought, aha, this is going to be easy, because nobody's written on Stewart. Well, that was the problem. No one had written on Stewart. And so I had to go back to the originals of everything. I called, there was nothing, and everything that there was I didn't feel was right. It just repeated what the book already said. So I got the names of the children from the University of Nebraska Press and got a hold of Clyde, the son in Washington, and I told him that I wanted, that I didn't think that the stories were all true stories, that they were fiction. And I think I didn't phrase it right, because he wasn't very willing to have me say, oh yes, they're all true stories, they really happened. And so I didn't get much from him, and so then I thought, well, these are letters, and so from my paper that was getting closer, the date was getting closer, right? I thought, I'll go to epistolary fiction and go back and put her within the tradition of epistolary or letter fiction. And so I wrote my paper showing how she was more than just a woman who wrote letters, she was a writer. And that's what the paper said, and that she used this traditional type of writing called epistolary fiction. I wrote a 20-page paper on this, analyzing the style and the language and the structure and the whole works. So I just sort of on a whim decided to send it to Clyde. And so I sent the paper to Clyde, and I gave him about a week to read it, and I called him up and asked him if he'd read the paper. And he was just thrilled, because what I had done was to prove that his mother was an author, not just another woman homesteader. And he says, hey, I've got all these letters and stories and stuff in this trunk at home. Do you want to do something with them? And I was broke. I had no money. And talked to Fran. She says, rob a bank. I don't care how you get there. Get up there, get those letters. So there I was, 49, Dad, can I have some money? So he gave me some money for the plane tickets, and I went up there, which goes to show that when you need to do something, you need to do it now, because in the time that I have done my research, 3 people have passed away just like this. It was kind of scary. I felt like I was a bad omen or something. But sometimes you need to do things now. I also was able to get a grant through the university that helped me with the rest of my traveling to Philadelphia and to New Jersey, and it became my dissertation. And because it was a subject not anyone had written, very much had written about, the University of Nebraska Press approached me and wanted to know if they could use it for a book. And so they kept it and sent it out to several scholars, and they sent it to an historian, and he says, put more history in. So I researched some more for another summer and put more history stuff in. And then they sent it out to another one who was a feminist, I think, or a woman writer. And they said, put more feminist stuff in. Okay, so I spent some more time and did some more research and put some more feminist stuff in. Finally, they decided the book was publishable and was accepted for publication. And then the process of what do I leave in and what do I put out in which stories. And so we added more original stories, or more original letters, took out some published stories, put in other published stories, rearranged some of the letters. They cut my afterword by about 40 pages. That broke my heart. And we marketed it for a more general audience. However, I insisted that all that research that I had done go in the footnotes. So that's why the book has footnotes. It was an interesting project. I think the thing that I would say about it is when you, and it's what I tell my students in my classes. They say, what should I write about? I says, which one do you like the best? You know, start there. Don't think which one is am I going to find the more research on, which one would be the easiest. You know, which one do you like the best? Because I've lived with this book for 7 years and I still like it. I still like her. I don't hate it. And that's hard not to do if you don't like the subject. But the moral of the story is, and what I wrote in Fran's book that she bought for her class was, look what can happen for a paper written in a class. And it really can. It really can. You're not just treading water. You're doing something important. You really are, for all the students. That was a long answer. Is there another question, Steve?
Susanne, after I read the Letters from a Woman Homesteader, I thought that the experience of homesteading and the place of Burnt Fork were the most important thing, and that was sort of a forming experience for her. Well, then after looking at your book, I began to change my mind, and I think that maybe she was already something of a character. She was already a storyteller, and that she is more important than the place, that we could just as well have had letters from a dry goods store if she married someone different. What do you think, how much is Burnt Fork and the homestead experience what made her, and how much of it was just who she was already?
I think you're absolutely true that Elinore was a strong person before she wrote the stories, and that Burnt Fork didn't make her this strong woman homesteader. She worked on the railroad for years. She took care of her younger brothers and sisters. She worked out in the hayfields with her grandmother in Oklahoma in the Indian Territory. She scrubbed floors and stoked coal in Denver. And I think there's a story that they didn't want me to put in here about an old woman living in Denver, a laundry woman who wanted to go to the circus. I think she wrote that. I think she wrote that when she was in Denver. However, I do think that Burnt Fork is important for her because she finally found a place she belonged. She was comfortable in, she fit in, and that she could write about. I think she could have written, letters from a dry goods store, but I think that the place, the sense of place was important, and we find that on almost all of the really good Western writers, they feel that sense of place. And I think that is what inspired her, because when you read through most of her letters, what you'll notice, some of her best writing is her description of the mountains and of the trees and of the birds and of the flowers. She's almost a naturalist. And I think that is what gave her the impetus to write. And whenever she needed to write, she would leave the homestead, the ranch, and she would go up on this mountain right across the valley, or she would go up in the cedars to the west rather than to the east, and get away and be alone in the forest without anyone around. And so I think that the place was really important to her, to make her, I don't know what the word would be, to make her more, to know who she was, to bring her a true identity. But she was definitely a strong character before she went to Burnt Fork. Any more questions? Yes?
You said that she didn't really have any formal education, but how, did she have any literary influences, or how did she actually develop her writing style without any formal education?
She told her children that the way she learned how to write was from scraps and pieces of paper she found, and she took it to the man who had the local grocery store, and he told her how to read and write. She said she also had some schooling. Now, when I went down to Oklahoma, I found that there was a school right near where she was born, about the only school in the Indian Territory. But it didn't last very long, and she said that the school teacher was hung for a horse thief. Again, is that embroidery or not? If she did have schooling, it was probably very, very short, maybe just the basics. She read voraciously. I think she started her reading when she was with Mrs. Coney in Denver. She was a very cultured lady. She was a school teacher. And Mrs. Coney continued to send her books when she was in Burnt Fork and send her magazines. And all of her correspondence would be sending her books. One of them, I noticed there's a new movie coming out, Enchanted April. That was one of her favorite books, was Enchanted April, and I think it's coming out right now as a movie. And Pollyanna, and she read National Geographic. She loved National Geographic and Atlantic Monthly, and she read the newspapers. And when she was in Denver, she went to the university seminars open for the public like this. And she just continued educating herself all of the time. And so her literary influences were basically, she had a bookshelf of 20 classics with Shakespeare. In my dissertation, I have a whole list of all of the books. Her daughter was typing on some paper, and Elinore ran out of paper for one of her manuscripts and used this scrap paper, and on the back she had evidently typed all the books on the bookshelf. So we have a list of all the books that she read. Many of them were classics like Cooper and Shakespeare and Sir Walter Scott, Dickens. A lot of them romantic, a lot of sentimental stuff. She seems like she really liked the sentimental type of writing, and I think that's the kind of person that she was. It sort of hurt her writing, too. What we do know that she grew as a writer and as a person throughout the years of her life, and it is documented in her letters. Her prose not only became more correct, and her style became more poetic and more mature, but her subjects became more worldly. It encompassed more than just the women's sphere around her homestead, and she also became much more introspective. What did not change, however, was that from the beginning to the end, she was always a great storyteller. Thank you.